I clicked the button, and we're live.
We're live. I'm learning a lot of things in the chat of you for your active viewers. This is very fascinating.
Oh, yeah, I told you we have a really good. I've told you this, Katie. Yes. Okay, and we're live. It is Thursday, June 3rd, 5:04 p.m. We are a little bit late because we were being chatty, and I was sharing presents that I bought for Nabiha when I was just in Iceland, and telling cicada stories. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Nabiha Syed, who is the president of the Markup, and before that, a seasoned media law attorney, which is how we got to know each other initially, because we were both working at the Information Society Project at Yale, and we had a bunch of mutual friends. And so, welcome to the show, Nabiha. It is so nice to have you.
Thank you for having me. I've already learned so much about cicadas and other things, so I can't wait to dive in.
You know, we call the chat the Greek chorus, and it is I don't know how to say this, the coolest group of people that has ever never met each other.
Yeah, it's like 200 people that are really nice and smart.
Yeah, it's proof that you can have a nice, cool, supportive, self-governing community on the internet.
Yeah.
What I feel like early internet was like, and I say this as a person who got on the internet in third grade, unsupervised, through free AOL CD-ROMs. And I was like, oh, this internet thing, it's really working. This is the utopia. Everything's going to be great. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, I think that was. So I'm just gonna I'm loving this because I get to ask a dorky question that I've never actually, asked you before, which is just like, tell us a little bit about your journey into being really motivated and really driven to work on freedom of the press issues and to kind of start going down that road. Did it happen before you went to law school, or was it happening before you went to law school, or did it happen once you were there?
Like most things, it was rooted in high school dysfunction. So I was
all great things are rooted in high school dysfunction.
Like they got to start somewhere. That's the origin story. And
it's so true. Everybody's origin story is really in some form of high school rejection.
Yeah, it's so true.
So mine had more of a national security component than I think most teenager dysfunction does. I was a teenager when 9/11 happened, and I remember literally one day my biggest concern being, will my parents let me go to the Sadie Hawkins dance? The answer was no. And a week later, the biggest concern being, oh my God, is the FBI going to knock on our door also, just like they did for some of our family members, other people in the Muslim community? I was a member of the Orange County mosque that many years later we found out was under FBI surveillance. And I, as like an angry, angsty Buffy the Vampire Slayer watching teenager, felt all this like, why is no part of the narrative that I'm seeing in my life, right? Where people are like all of a sudden not going to the mosque, not talking to other community members, like really self-censoring. I don't see any of that narrative on TV, which I watched obsessively, right? Like I've been a news junkie my whole life. I started watching the PBS NewsHour with my dad when I was a kid, and I had very sophisticated, precocious thoughts like Bill Clinton should be president because George Bush had a turn already. Duh, take turns. I loved the news, and I didn't see any part of my life reflected in the news, which were asking questions like, are they with us or are they against us? And I'm like, which us do I get to count as? Like, where do I belong? And so there was born a really beautifully naive idea that I still buy into, which is that people just knew what was happening, they wouldn't stand for it, right? If facts were to be free, if they were to be out there, people would make better choices. It couldn't be that regular Americans wanted my community to feel scared. Like, I remember my mom studying for her citizenship test. I remember how big of a deal it was when she became a citizen. Like, we were two Americans. And so I kind of just had that seed planted, and every time I thought about what I wanted to do, it would wiggle its way back to this sort of gnawing belief of like, there's information that people need to know that they don't have. And so I got to law school, and I had no idea why I was there. I was told that I needed to have a higher degree by my parents, and I took the MCAT and the LSAT. I did better on the LSAT because I didn't study for the MCAT, so that's not a test you wing. It's not. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to go to law school. I got there, and I had no idea why I was there. So then the best thing in the world happened to me, which is I got to just try out, I went to every lecture. Took as many classes as I could, did everything, and sort of wormed my way back to this idea through media law, right? Like, there's this fundamental presumption in a lot of First Amendment news gathering law that's like, the facts are important. The public deserves those facts. If they get them, this feeds into self-governance. It's a whole set of First Amendment theories. And that's kind of how I got here. I ended up starting a clinic, the first media law clinic in the country when I was in law school, did a lot of Freedom of Information Act stuff. But again, it was just like rooted in being an angry teenager. That's where the motivation comes from.
I love it.
And does media law actually satisfy the angry teenager in you?
What a good question, Ben. No, and here's why. Here's why. One, the angry teenager is forever. I think it's not just facts that people need to make better choices. It's narratives. It's the stories they tell themselves about who they are. It's all of these bigger cultural factors that go beyond like, my FOIA request will get the right facts and then the truth will be unveiled. I've been thinking a lot about this really great essay from a couple of weeks ago by Hamilton Nolan, where he talks about like the misinformation problem isn't just that we don't have facts. There's a lot of facts. It's that we allow, false realities or totally false narratives to spin out of control. And so we have things like we waste all this time thinking about like, well, okay, are these big tech companies censoring conservative voices? And this narrative can sort of spin out of control. Whether or not it's tethered to facts doesn't really matter, right? The terrain of debate isn't on individual facts, it's these larger arcs and stories. And so that's the next big bad, right? Where I'm like, how do we talk about social and cultural narrative? And that's something that media law is not perfectly equipped to handle because it's a much larger social set of questions. But it's fun in the meantime.
Because I find that, Shane Harris likes to call me a defrocked journalist, but I did practice journalism for quite a number of years, and I do something sort of related to journalism for the last dozen years. And I find that it satisfies many itches of mine, but one of them that it doesn't satisfy is the angry teenager in me. Because one thing, you have this idea that you'll reveal the truth and then things will fix themselves. And actually what often happens is you don't quite reveal the truth. You reveal some sliver of the truth and it has no impact on anything at all. And so the angry teenager in me is chronically asking, why the hell do we do this? Why did I just spend the last 5 years banging my head against a wall? It's really the old philosopher in me that is satisfied by journalism or the litigation that I do in pursuit of it.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if your angry teenager is as impatient as mine, and whether the impatience is the difference between the teenager and the philosopher, right? Because when in my most impatient moments, I'm like, the root of the impatience is the change isn't fast enough. But I was thinking about just earlier this week, last week, the anniversary of the bombing of Black Wall Street. Right. And having a conversation about the bombing in Tulsa was not a thing that, at least to me, seemed possible 5 years ago, right? But then you have like a show like The Watchmen that introduced it into the consciousness of a lot of people through art, right? Through television. And then other people sort of picking up the thread and saying, you know what, we should actually talk about this. What's going on? And that the change is incremental and the change is slow. And my angry teenager is never going to be happy with that. But the old philosopher that takes a broad lens on time might be like, the reason we do the journalism, the reason we do the work is because it's just like next stepping stone to chipping away at what the truth is. But like one article is rarely going to be the thing that blasts us into the truth zone. I think that's how I think about it.
I agree with that. I'm like, I don't know which camp it puts me in. I'm very impatient, but I'm also a realist. And so I realize that my impatience has no purpose except to like frustrate me. And so like basically I mean, I look at like, when we met, Nabiha, it was like 2018 when my article was first coming out. And like, look at the world now. Like this went from being like, and I've said this a million times in this show, but like I went from being like literally like Mark Zuckerberg, can you fix my email? Like testifying when he was like testifying in Congress in April of 2018 to it being kind of like this sophisticated conversation we're having now. And everyone, it's on the front page of every newspaper. Like no one thought that this was a real thing. Like just 5 years ago, I feel like there's an incredible, and like, I don't know, I think about Obergefell and I think about like gay rights and I think about just like what it was to be gay when I was in high school and then what it was to be gay like when like 10 years later. And it was just like a very rapid kind of change, all things considered. We do not have like the life cycle of cicadas, but like we do have like, I mean, well, at least like, I don't know if they're conscious underground. Do we know anything about cicada consciousness?
I mean, Ben, you're going to know the most, right? You've had three.
Yes, Ben absolutely knows the most.
You're a cicadeologist in my mind.
You're muted, friend.
Honestly, there is very little evidence of cicada consciousness. And
they're just chitinous,
there is
like hormone sacs that like kind of like go around. Like I think.
Yeah, I think if you remove, they are basically teenage sexual energy without the consciousness.
Yeah.
They emerge. They have basically a giant orgy for 3 or 4 weeks, and then they die. It's a very peculiar life cycle.
But anyways, I was about to ask you about working at BuzzFeed. But if we want to switch topics, or if you have something to say about consciousness. But I was just thinking that like, I wonder if how much we can thank social media for the rapidity at which we are making some of these changes. I feel like it's a forcing function that like was not present before. Whereas like you'd have one article in Washington Post, and if people subscribe to the Washington Post, that was one thing. And now maybe you don't subscribe to the Washington Post, but 400,000 people that aren't subscribers to the Washington Post also retweet it or respond to it or start debates about it. And like, it just increases, as like Dana Boyd would say, like the reach of like, and the amplification, of course, of like all of these things. And then it becomes an unavoidable kind of reputation management on these companies and on politics.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so what I was going to say before was I was thinking back to the time when your article was coming out, and at the same time, you were advising me in the outdoor cafes of Brooklyn of how to write my own piece, which was very much like falling in your long shadow of how you'd set up the social media platforms as a new governors. And I remember distinctly, I was like, Kate, I think the marketplace of ideas is basically a legal meme. I'll tie that into BuzzFeed in a second. I think it's a meme. It's a very successful meme. People have glommed onto it because it like makes sense of the world in the way that memes do, and everyone repeats it. But I
remember this so specifically.
I was like,
in the backyard at 4th Avenue Pub.
Exactly. And I was like, it's wrong. Like I think if not wrong, incomplete, right? Like we rely so much on this meme that we have in our head, this set of interactions of the marketplace, and like maybe don't interrogate enough all of the other pathologies that ride along with that particular perception. And I felt terrified to say that to you, right? Where I was terrified to say it out of my mouth. I was terrified to say it to another like First Amendment information like communications expert. And now I'm like, there's people slamming the marketplace of ideas all over the place on Twitter, right? Everyone's like, maybe this meme has run its course. It's been a good 100 years. Maybe we should think of like another framing of it. Or maybe we can accept it for what it is, which is like a useful crutch, but not the end all be all. And like, actually, we do need to regulate the marketplace a little bit when it comes to speech, if you're a big platform. And so
I want to turn that into BuzzFeed for a second, but I also want to ask you, so like now that you bring that up, and I had forgotten about that until you just brought it up, but I want to know Ben's thoughts on this too. Like, that's so great. And then what is the ideas that we are talking about in the marketplace? Is it facts? It's not really. Like, I think that mostly Micklejohn is talking about like knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just ideas. It's not just information. It's an ability to have like a valence of a gatekeeping on certain types of ideas. So there's an idea that it's knowledge, not facts. Mm-hmm. And I think that maybe that's falling away because of the lack of gatekeepers. And I think that you're right. What do you think, Ben?
Well, so first of all, I love the idea of attacking the marketplace of ideas metaphor. But I think the first attack on it should be that, you know, if you have a product like there is no other marketplace where the product liability standard is actual malice.
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, if you start with start by taking the idea of a marketplace seriously. Like, in a normal marketplace, if I go in and attack you, I will be arrested. In the marketplace of ideas, I go in and attack you, and that's presumptively First Amendment protected activity. Mm-hmm. And so I think the idea, like, if you want to take it seriously as a marketplace, take it seriously as a marketplace. There are very few that are this deregulated.
I love that. And I think that is the right place to start. If I was a purveyor of toasters and my toaster blew up in Kate's face and I was like,
screamed racist epithets at it. Right? Like you know, you buy a toaster, you plug it in, and it you know, calls you a cunt. Right? Like that would be a very odd market.
Right. It's a smart toaster.
I know some people that would be really into that type of toast.
Yeah.
I think in lieu of fun should have a whole merch angle, and you should just really come up with the cunt screaming.
Well, we have a merch angle.
Cunt screaming toasters.
Yeah, why not? Well, you know, it would not be an acceptable defense for me to be like, I did not intend specifically for this to blow up in her face, or something that rises to the equivalent level of actual malice, of the intentionality or reasonable knowledge thereof. You just be like, no, strict liability for your exploding fucking toaster. Okay,
right.
Just like do something about this. But we don't import that into speech for I think reasons that I understand, that I agree with, that I get nervous about when we are moving from sort of these institutions that have norms of knowledge and expertise production, that have methods of policing, to a decentralized place where like there in fact is no self-regulatory, self-policing institution production of knowledge norms. There isn't any of that. And then what do you do with that shit? And what do you do when both of those, it's not like the institutions of knowledge production or expertise have totally evaporated. They still exist, right? Like the New York Times still exists, professors, scientists, they still exist. So they're also on those same platforms, right? So how do you deal with this sort of competing standards in the same space?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me, the fundamental problem with the marketplace of ideas metaphor is that most markets are highly regulated, mm-hmm. right? If I go down to my local supermarket, you have FDA jurisdiction, you have Department of Agriculture jurisdiction, you have taxation, you have, there's a million regulations that govern that marketplace. Mm-hmm. If I go to Twitter, there is the Twitter terms of service and nothing else. Oh, and I suppose the margins of the First Amendment, if I engage in a true threat, if I mm-hmm. but beyond that, it is essentially an unregulated space. And I think, like, if you're going to take the marketplace of ideas seriously, you have to take, like, it can't be, like, what doesn't work, in my view, is to say it's a marketplace in that the customers are very sophisticated and they'll understand that they'll, faced with a real choice between the racist ideas and the great ideas and the horrible abusive like, over time, the market will move toward the right thing. In the absence, like, is as implausible to me as the idea that if you have a wholly unregulated giant food store, over time, I suppose we will move toward relatively little food poisoning. But that does not actually help the people who get botulism in the meantime.
So there's this sort of, like, pseudo-Darwinistic, like, a thread there, right, where it's like, well, if enough people get botulism, then the people with weak stomachs will get weeded out, and then the true brave stomachs will rise to the top. And of course, like, that rightfully sounds absurd to our ears, but then that's what we think should happen in the speech context, and we don't talk about all the people
exactly what we think.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm totally okay with the marketplace of ideas metaphor as long as you treat it as a real marketplace. And, when Holmes coined it, he was referring to something, I think, quite specific, which was don't ban anti-war speech as a criminal matter because people will benefit by the combat of ideas.
No, that's very specific.
You can accept that in the context in which... I think you can accept that in the context in which he said it and not generalize it to the point that it prohibits all kinds of... that it requires an entirely laissez-faire market in this one area and absolves us of any obligation to think about consequences.
There's also like in the example that you raised, like, Holmes' intentionality around that also looked at power dynamics, right? The anti-war protesters were very different than sort of, like, the dominant narrative at the time, and so there was an inherent understanding, like, you need this speech. Let's protect this speech. Sort of weird, perverse moment that we live in is the people who claim the mantle of these protections are ones that, like, have enjoyed some privileges from society, right? So, like, the richness of hearing people, white supremacists and those adjacent to it, claiming this mantle is a little like head tilt at times. Where I'm like, I don't think this was meant for you. And we've had times, of course, like where we have extended these to, these protections to fringes like the KKK. But it, like, starts to take on a different valence when we see it in social media and how it's weaponized and who it silences and who doesn't get to speak. Kate, sorry, I
was gonna double down on that. I mean, that idea. So one thing is the marketplace's ideas, and specifically Holmes' reference to it, is speaking about that. And I'm going to put a different valence on it. I'm going to call it like a scientific type engagement with the idea of combating an idea and stress testing an idea through speech was part of the marketplace of ideas that Holmes, like, enjoyed and contemplated. But it wasn't about abusive speech. It wasn't about just, like, slanderous speech. These were always exceptions to, like, the marketplace of ideas, right? And that also, that, like, to your power dynamics point about the marketplace of ideas, is that it's like there is a competitive nature to a marketplace, and that if you have a competitive nature to a marketplace where people have equality in power in which they're placing their ideas and things, then the best and most meritocratic will, like, rise to the top in theory, and there won't be this type of shift in other kinds of realms. But also, like, obviously that doesn't what.
But also, there's a total difference between jailing the Lutheran minister, real case, who wants to, no offense, Hillary, but this is a real World War I case. The Lutheran minister who spoke against the war, is imprisoned. There's a difference between that being the regulatory model and Twitter's terms of service saying you're not allowed to be a white supremacist in our house.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly okay with the marketplace of ideas governing the first circumstance. But the idea that you have a right, some God-given right to go on Twitter and attack people is ridiculous.
Can I tell you guys my new idea that I'm writing a paper on for the new peer-reviewed journal? I think you'd love this, Nabiha. I haven't gotten a chance to talk to you about it yet, but it's arguing for a marketplace of governance. That instead of, it's basically trying to mash up a lot of the antitrust, competition-focused imaginations around big tech and create a more nuanced version that meets the rights-based kind of contemplation of a speech platform that is not based like on an Amazon kind of Lena Khan kind of antitrust paradox. So basically, suffice it, like I basically am saying that like in Amazon Marketplace, the problem you have with Amazon Marketplace is that it is that like one of the things Amazon does is push out third-party vendors by creating like mimicking whatever third-party vendors are selling, and then undercutting the price and creating a vertical monopoly to like across their horizontal monopoly that they already have. And then, so this is problematic for a million reasons, and it's bad for third-party vendors and it's bad for consumers. And so I'm taking that specific part of Khan's argument and saying, okay, and so what's happening in speech platforms is similar in the sense that third-party vendors are you and me, the speakers. Like third-party vendors here are the speakers and consumers are the listeners. So it's a speaker-listener kind of dichotomy, and it's matching it up with kind of this consumer privacy or consumer type of framework. But Facebook does not do the same thing that Amazon does. It does not undercut like the third part, like the speakers. It does not try to like insert its own speech into whatever it is that the speakers are saying. It just kind of uses it and rides with it. Its entire business is the fact that there are speakers and listeners. And so therefore, like using Khan's own argument, there is basically no, you can't use an antitrust argument to break up speech platforms, not just because they're rights-based, but because it actually doesn't flow even from a commerce kind of perspective. And then I argue that there should be instead, like, if you're interested in creating a marketplace of ideas, you need a marketplace of governance. And the regulation that should be created is disclosure regulation, mandating disclosure from platforms and various private platforms rather than so that consumers can choose and speakers and listeners can choose which platforms they go to.
So the ideal end state being there is a federation of different platforms. They have sort of different governance policies and everyone chooses your own adventure.
Yeah. And like,
but I have a question. Sorry, go ahead. I don't want to.
Go ahead.
That's the paper.
I want to ask you how you reconcile this set of instincts you're describing with your day job. So a media lawyer is almost always, the question is generally for the guest, Kate. How, like, the instinct you're describing is a certain skepticism of kind of laissez-faire attitudes toward speech environments. Mm-hmm. But the job of a media lawyer is almost always to defend the most robust conceptions of free press, free speech, and you, in your professional capacity, must often be making arguments that sound in the more libertarian understandings of this. How do those two things go together?
Yeah, the division between day job and night terrors. No, so in the, you're right. In my day job is formed by a guild mentality of like, we need to create the most room to run to minimize any potential liability for any of the people that we employ, right? That's the game. That's the game as a media defense lawyer. What I worry about is, because I want to be employed in 40 years, 30 years, this sort of like total decentralization and distrust for media institutions as relevant actors in an information ecosystem leads to people being like, I don't need to read the failing New York Times or the Washington Post. These things don't need to exist. I have an information ecosystem where I get my information from a random person on Twitter, and that's just fine because I'm more connected to them. It's more relevant. It's churning out content that doesn't go through the laborious, painstaking, time-intensive, like active news gathering. So I get my quick hits of facts quickly. If you play out that universe over 30 years, the sort of guild mentality we're using to protect these institutions won't exist to serve any institutions, right? Like, what happens to these institutions? So I think a lot about like the discrepancy between the short-term incentives of what my area of the law demands and what is happening in the information landscape over decades, and wondering, like, would there be a Markup or a BuzzFeed or a New York Times to employ me in the future? Do people even care about where information comes from? And I think that's sort of the daylight to think about what is actually the right balance that ensures longevity, that ensures like a sense of doctrines that actually make sense and map onto the reality that we have. And so it makes the medium term real sticky.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. Can I ask, so you are now the president of the Markup, so you have taken on a very different role from being the lawyer, a media lawyer at these companies, although that is still a muscle that you have, although maybe you're not flexing it in the same capacity as you did before. But you were head of litigation at BuzzFeed and associate general counsel.
Mm-hmm.
And that included during the time that Ben Smith used to be there, and that the BuzzFeed published the dossier, which was a lot of stories. Like, I think that BuzzFeed had gotten, and we talked about this at the time, that BuzzFeed was walking this line between funding itself with these like listicles, but then also really kind of doing some daring reporting on a lot of things. And I'm just really curious, like, I don't know. Well, first, I guess, tell us about your time at BuzzFeed and what kind of some of the memorable moments are. In particular, I just remember you doing so much work with the dossier and defending that and how all of that went down. And I feel like a lot of the world isn't aware that was something that BuzzFeed really went out on a limb for.
And you guys also had Cormier and Leopold, who were did incredible work on Russia stuff, and also kind of made a spectacular error. I don't know if that was when you were there. It's a really complicated picture that BuzzFeed had in that period of time.
Yeah, totally. It's going back a little bit to Ben's question, I think BuzzFeed was the perfect place to bridge from what does the parameters of the doctrine require me to argue, and what does the larger landscape need, require, incentivize in this sort of shifting space, right? Because I was at a law firm right before I came to BuzzFeed where it was like straight defense work, like serve your client, do your job.
Which firm were you with?
Levine, Sullivan, Cook and Schultz. So all First Amendment all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, coming to BuzzFeed, it was like, well, this is a new kind of place with a new set of possibilities, because we have this cross subsidy with the listicle side, with much more understanding of sort of culture, like what the power of culture, because that's what the listicle side was really designed to tap into, right? Like, what is internet culture in a particular moment? And then walking into a newsroom where Ben Smith is like, we want this to be the most aggressive, most litigious in the access sense newsroom in the country. So have at it, which was like a joy for me. I think where it reached, there were really interesting moments where you see sort of old tradition and the desire to have the public know everything they can possibly know about something in real time, going back to urgency, when you think of a thing like the Steele dossier, right? So like, without telling tales out of school, because I'll leave that to Ben Smith, And there was this and he's talked about this publicly, especially.
He's talked about it a lot.
He's talked about it a lot. So this feeling that,
and it's his privilege to waive, not yours.
Exactly. So I'll be like, Google Ben Smith dossier, and you'll see a lot of stuff on this. But like building on some of the legal arguments we made around this, which really rode on this concept of the fair report privilege, meaning that if this is a fair and true report of something that's happening in, the corners of governmental action, the public has a right to know about it.
Can I just say, as a neutral observer of this isn't a complicated case. This material was given to the FBI by John McCain.
Yep.
Personally handed it to the director of the FBI. If you are allowed to report on the activities of government, it is not a tough call that you get to report that this document exists.
That's what we thought. And I will never forget the day that we published it. I was about to leave on my honeymoon the following day. And I'd known about the existence of this, and everyone.
That reminds me that we should tell the story of how I crashed your wedding to be how we met.
Two friends, because Kate crashed my wedding. And so everyone in certain corners of media had seen the dossier. People talked about it in the back, in the backdrop. People made decisions not to publish it, and it sort of, thinking back to the impatient teenager, like crawled underneath my skin, where I was like, the idea that everyone knows about this while we're during an election cycle about a person who's going to become president, and that we're just like not going to let the public know about the fact that there's a credible set of concerns, credible enough for someone to be investigating, seems off, right? But everyone was sort of chasing it down. So it doesn't look like anything's going to happen with the dossier. So I go, I plan my honeymoon. I realize that I don't have contact lenses. And I'm leaving the next day. So I go to the eye doctor down the street, and the eye doctor's like, you really haven't had your eyes dilated in a really long time. You should probably do the glaucoma test. You should dilate your eyes. And I was like, okay. So she dilates my eyes. I'm sitting there, in comes a call from Ben Smith. And Ben Smith says, we've able to pin down credibly that the dossier has, in fact, been circulating at the highest levels of government. Like, we have that piece dead to rights. So to Ben's point,
he was, by the way, correct about that.
Yeah.
I mean, been reported that, there is no question that it was given to the most senior levels of government.
Yeah. And so he's like, we know that part, so we're going to run it. So I need you to look over an article. And I was like, the funny thing about looking over an article is that I can't read anything right now. My eyes are dilated with the eye doctor. So you're going to have to read it to me. And the important piece here is going to be that you have to make it real clear that the reason that you're publishing this is because it is circulating at the highest levels of government. You have to be really clear about what you know and what you don't know. And that's where that's like a real media law gamble, right? Because otherwise we had been like, we have full confidence that this is true. We have no reason to doubt it. We'd start to fall within the shadow of the actual malice standard, right? Like, we have no reason to doubt this. But of course, we're not endorsing it. We hadn't borne out every sentence that was in that dossier. That was not why we were publishing it, right? It was a different type of beast. But we also weren't immediately Julian Assanging it and just throwing it out to the public. Like, we were like, this is the hook. This is the nexus. We're going to make that clear in the precursor to the actual publication of the dossier, because we think the public deserves to know, and there's a value to knowing something that isn't firmed up right away, right? And it's that sort. I think a lot about, in hearing Kate and others in the chat talk about the nature of expertise and knowledge. What is the status of things that you're like, we don't know this for sure yet, but it's pretty important that you know the half-baked version, right? That you know that this is a discussion. And I thought about it a lot throughout the pandemic, where there was so much information around other things that we didn't know. How do you appropriately communicate this is what we know right now, we don't know everything?
Look, as somebody who had the dossier before it was published, made an active decision not to publish it. and instead communicated it to senior levels of government because I am impure as a journalist and was much more concerned with the matter being investigated properly than I was with public access. There is no doubt in my mind that the story, this is material that is actively being investigated by the FBI right now, was true. And I suppose we can all carefully cover ourselves with fig leaves and not use words like P-tape or not refer to the contents of the material. But I don't, look, I made the opposite decision that Ben Smith did. And so I don't want to say it's an obvious call. It is obviously not libelous to report, like whether it's the right journalistic call to do that, to say this material is in the hands of the FBI and it is being actively investigated and vetted is a true statement, full stop. And there's just, it's been reported that, the director, and roughly the time that you guys, shortly before you guys published it, there's just no, if you look at that correspondence, there's just no doubt in my mind that what you guys reported at the time was true, full stop, no question.
Yeah, it was really careful and smart. It was very narrow. And I know, well. Anyway.
Yeah, and then then we got sued by everybody. Michael Cohen was early in the game. He bowed out of his litigation because he had bigger problems to attend to. I had some really entertaining phone calls with him. A handful of Russian oligarchs. And it was one of those things where you start to see the intersection of the business call, the moral call, the legal call, the journalistic call, right? All in this sort of collision of business-wise, it was not cheap to defend that case, right? As obvious as it is to you and I, going through the entire rigmarole of proving that out in 3 different sets of litigations of very well-funded people, Michael Cohen accepted. That was expensive for an organization to take on in a time that news organizations don't have, excess sums of money floating around, even a place like BuzzFeed at that time. There's the moral call. There was a journalistic call, which of course reasonable people disagree on, but Ben felt firm in his. And then, I think the legal call, what felt like it was very transgressive to say, we're going to hang our hat on this other defense, on the fair report privilege, and not actual malice, right? We're going to choose not to do that. And we know that this is the thing that as media lawyers, we have litigated time and time again to give ourselves that space to be able to say a lot. I'm not going to avail ourselves of that space because that's not actually really what's going on here. It was tough going, but we've been winning. Those have all been going pretty well. So, and then I left BuzzFeed after we had we won on summary judgment in the big case that we had in Miami, which was brought by one particular Russian oligarch, and it felt like, okay, enough. There's been enough support for our fair report privilege theory that I feel like I can responsibly bow out and take on a new challenge.
Yeah, it was great. We have a question from Michael McKenna.
Ooh.
Hi, Michael.
Hello. I am not an orange blob today.
No.
My question is about the recent reporting about the Stanford Federalist Society weaponizing the academic complaint process to suppress satire that's aimed at them. And where's the intersection between these paralegal authorities like an academic institution and First Amendment satire rights?
Yeah, great question. And are you familiar with this thing that's happened?
Yeah,
I feel like I have high level. I'm happy to give it over to Ben. My understanding was that Stanford did overturn whatever restriction they had on the student graduating.
Yeah, they've walked it back, but it's worth talking about for one split second, which is just Ben, unless you want to go ahead and explain.
No, go ahead. Your internet's better than mine today.
Okay. So there was a student at Stanford Law, a 3L, and he wrote to like basically what I imagine is kind of like the wall at YLS, but it was to an all student list, and he jokingly put like a PDF of like a satirical kind of like Federalist Society meeting that would be discussing it was just kind of like, what was it specifically, Nabiha? Do you remember? Like, it was something that was like obvious satire, but like it was mocking the First Amendment. Oh, it was the originalist case for inciting insurrection. That's what it was. So it was kind of like this. I will share my screen for a second just and let people kind of see what this was. That there was this kind of like moment in which this was, I think this is going to be the right.
I mean, it was your basic spoof of
an
originalist defense of indefensible conduct, and it was written in roughly the style that FedSoc invitations are written in. I actually thought it was pretty funny.
It was actually kind of good. Sorry,
but I've been on so many FedSoc panels that have, roughly this format. This is unreadable at this level.
I'm sorry. Okay.
It's okay.
Anyways, I tried. But the long and the short of it is all of a sudden he did get a hold put on the Federalist Society complained. And he got a hold put on his graduation, which was going to bar him from taking he was taking the bar exam in Minnesota, the Minnesota bar exam, because he needed to present that he graduated. And they have literally, I think Mark Joseph Stern at Slate kind of broke the story kind of nationally, and then it they immediately walked it back and said, I think that same day, that they were going to release the hold and everything was fine. But it's a story of kind of increasing at the university level, something that we were both, I don't know if you took classes with Robert Post, but Jack Balkin also talks about this. The argument that academic freedom, that specifically in the realm of a knowledge, an area of learning and an area of having to challenge your own beliefs and being presented, that there should be a more stringent kind of, because it's a smaller community marketplace of ideas and commitment to academic freedom and people to have the freedom to publish things, because that's the idea of knowledge creating institutions. And this was just bonkers. I mean, on top of all of the tenure kind of craziness that's happening at UNC and other places. So I don't know. I think that was kind of the question was what do you think about that happening right now, and how does it tie in with bigger kind of free speech concerns?
I mean, in some ways, I wonder how it interacts with your conclusions from the paper that you're writing, right? So if the end state of what you're saying, that there's a variety of platforms or places that are governed by different standards, different normative standards that they set, because these are all private entities, as is Stanford. And they can sort of choose their own adventure, right? Of what norms they want to import and what they don't. Which to me, sidebar, seems like it introduces a whole set of associational rights questions, right?
Yes. Not that we care about that.
I care about the right of association. I feel like Boy Scouts v. Dale is a very interesting case, but sidebar.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
But if we accept that that's okay, then it's really just a set of questions around institutional identity and norms for things. So actually the grievance isn't, is this violating First Amendment standards, but really, do we expect Stanford, a private institution, to adhere to the outside limit of or import First Amendment standards in a particular way, or are we comfortable with them taking positions that are well within that? And that, I mean, feels like a flavor of all the questions that we're having about platforms that you've written about for so long. And I would agree with the argument that Post makes, right? Is that for academic freedom, we actually want them to take quite a broad stance on what is permissible and what's not permissible. And we expect that's part of the identity of being a respected academic institution, is that you allow that. But, you know, there's all kinds of challenges to that, particularly from students these days that don't envision the university having quite that role.
It is like truly a very strange time for universities, and has been for like the last 5 years. But I think it's really kind of started to reach this really interesting kind of demands and entitlement from individuals versus from individual students who think that they have, because they're paying all this money and are like expecting some type of like education, that they have demands that they want to place on that I've always kind of been very curious about. And anyways, we should have a different episode and like have an entire episode about academic freedom and have Robert on to talk about this. But like the idea of like the marrying of customer, student as customer, like, right? Like I pay this money, and how weird it is that like you pay all of this money into an institution and you might not get a degree, which is the only thing that has actual value as like an investment. And that like that is part of like what you decide, and that is in fact supposed to be like kind of the editorial and the advertising side of like a newsroom, supposed to be separate. Like you're not supposed to know that this person's parents contributed $100,000 to the university and that's why they're there, or that they're paying full tuition, or that they're there on scholarship, and that you're just supposed to grade them and judge them on their merits. And that like there is this new kind of like, well, we're like kind of, we have an entitlement to a certain type of education versus, I don't know. I think that that's a very interesting problem.
Yeah, the university as business. I mean, I would love to see some sort of poll of 18-year-olds who are going off to degree granting institutions to like understand what they really, why are you going to college and what do you expect to get, right? Because it was always explained to me as like this was effectively transactional. You go to get a degree, you get a degree to confer status and afford to you a profession, and like that's what you do, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Where did you go to college?
Johns Hopkins.
So I think this is a genuine divide between elite private universities and small liberal arts colleges.
I believe that.
I think, you know, like I have many problems with Oberlin College, where I went. One of them is not that there was anything transactional about our relationship with it. And I think people who go to small liberal arts colleges have a weirdly non-transactional relationship with it compared with the universities next door, so that, you know, people who go to Swarthmore are different from people who go to UPenn, right? And there's this very earnest quality to the relationship between the small liberal arts college student and their institution that is a completely different relationship than exists between Hopkins and its students and you know all the and their students.
I think that's totally right. I mean, in the sort of height of the sort of like phase one, I guess, of like the sort of student speech crisis, like, oh no, these soft students, they don't understand anything. I went up and I did a talk with Penn, with Suzanne Nossel
I remember
at
that.
Middlebury. Yeah, and I had a really interesting meeting with students afterwards where like elements of sort of this divide came through, right? So I remember distinctly this one woman, a young woman of color, saying to me, she's like, I came here so I could get a degree and I don't feel safe. When these sort of things are said in classrooms, when these speakers are invited, I don't feel safe here, right? Which I like very much hear and see, and I've made, you know, safety-oriented arguments when I talk about speech on platforms. I'm not at all spiritually averse to what she's saying. But then another student saying, well, I came here to learn how to tackle things I disagree with, right? So I actually want to be exposed to these people who come because I think that helps me understand what my arguments are. How do I counter that? How do I persuade against that? You know, the idea of an institution as changing how you think is a very different, and teaching you how to think and structuring how you build arguments is a very different route from which many different things follow than I'm here to get a degree and this is an unsafe ride at Disneyland, which is not, it was cheapening what she was saying, but like it's just a different approach to it. But I wonder how much of our market logic introduced to different things really doesn't map on, it doesn't, like market business logic does not map onto higher education institutions. It just should not. They are different things. And we have to accept that language.
Yeah, but like I also think that like there are like a lot of small and like lower tier institutions that are basically degree conferring institutions, that are status conferring institutions, and they are ways for people to level up from first generation families or from working class families or from places where people have not a lot of education to get to the next level, and that they have basically built an entire sustained business model around that, while simultaneously kind of masking themselves as intellectual in the idea of intellectual pursuits. And I think that is just coming to a head in that like they have not committed themselves to being about the pursuit of intellect and knowledge, and then they've not committed themselves to being like they've more committed themselves to being about like the trade of like being like an educational institution and a degree conferring institution. And that like the expectations and the empowerment of individual students has made them have to confront some of these like very difficult questions. And like it's hard for faculty and other people. But I'm gonna bring in David, who's been patiently waiting. There were a bunch of questions, by the way, Nabiha, about Gawker, and I'm really sad we didn't get to Gawker v. Balea. I know I would have loved to have heard your thoughts. We're running out of time. I know. But David, hi.
Hi.
Nice Van Buren like background.
Yeah, I like that. Scraping is not a crime.
It's for you. So what are the thanks so much for coming on. What are the two or three tools that you would suggest to members of the public when they evaluate what is published by the press? Specifically, can you talk about dark patterns?
Ooh, dark patterns. Well, okay, so tools are interesting. How would I relate tools to dark? Honestly, Markup can build a tool around dark patterns, but I didn't say that. I mean, an intellectual tool that you should be using, and this going back to dark patterns, is thinking about what is the business incentive for a particular prompt that you might be receiving on any website. And that's like really easy to understand when you're seeing the ads for toe fungus at the bottom of a Washington Post article, that come up through Taboola or whatever. But when it comes to dark patterns, when you're getting a nudge to sign up here or not cancel or do whatever, thinking about how there's dual interests at play. There is the business interest, and then there's the competing journalistic interest to also live to publish another day, which every organization, institution is grappling with. I think that's a good intellectual tool. You might be asking about more practical, like what's a thing a browser plugin I can have or something like that. And that I would say, setting up an information acquisition ecosystem that removes as much of advertising influence as you can is going to help you stay away from dark patterns. So or anything else that surveillance capitalism incentivizes you towards. So using DuckDuckGo, or before you're going to a website, checking, running it through Blacklight, which is a tool that Markup offers that reveals to you, what does invisible trade look like when you type in a URL? What are the cookies? What are the Canvas fingerprinters? What are the other tidbits of information that are being extracted from you and shared elsewhere? Blacklight is a helpful just sort of starting point to understand how that interacts with your life. But I would say between Blacklight and DuckDuckGo, that's like a good start for navigating the surveillance ecosystem that we're all a part of.
Yeah, I want to underscore the tools that the Markup has created. We talked about them when Julia was on the show, but they are kind of amazing, and they are, I think, changing journalism forever, and no one else is investing in those types of tools. And it is just I don't know. It's I kind of love how you guys do the work of being there should be a tool for this, and you create the tool, you use the tool to push out a story or a couple of stories, but then you also make the tool available. You make your code available, you do this, and it's just it's completely It is completely different than how most other kind of journalistic organizations are working, and I just think it's amazing. So, and we're gonna have. Sorry, I keep calling you Ann. Nabiha, we're gonna have to leave it there.
Yeah, someday we're going to need an explanation for that, Kate.
Why I call her N?
Oh,
it's just her.
Ann, not Anne.
Oh no!
I thought you were serially calling her Anne, and I was like,
I just call her N a lot because, like,
okay, that one I understand. I was just confused by repeatedly calling her Anne.
Because I'm really uncomfortable with the word Nabiha.
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't know. I didn't ask until like the 8th time.
Thanks for coming, Ann. Yes, I was going someone. I will say this. So the funny story of how I met Nabiha, which has got to be like one of the best things ever, was we had a mutual friend who was in town, and Nabiha used to live like a block and a half from my apartment. And so she was like, I never met her, and I've heard about her, and blah, blah. And a friend was like, oh, she's getting married today. I'm going over to her apartment at like this time. It's a small wedding. It's no big deal. You should just like come. And I was like, are you sure? Like this is a person's like wedding. And I'm like, what am I supposed to wear? Like, she was like, and I'm like, it seems like a weird way to like meet someone for the first time. And like, and so, sure enough, I like walk the 90 seconds over to like Nabiha's apartment, and the doorman lets me up, and I knock on the door, and her husband to be answers the door and is like, you must have the wrong apartment, and closes the door. And I'm like, what is happening? Where am I? And I like go downstairs and I sit in the lounge, and I'm texting my friend who's supposed to meet me there. I'm like, are you here? Like, what is going on? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? And she was just like, oh, I'm really late. I can't make it. I'm going to have to go directly to the venue. So I can't meet you at at the apartment. So you're just going to have to introduce yourself to Nabiha. I'm like, absolutely not. Am I like introducing myself to this woman on her wedding day? And showing up and crashing this crazy. And you came down and you were the most, you were like, you can still come. You should come. I'm so sorry. And you came down, and I was like, you have a thread on your dress. And I was like, pulling off these and I was like grooming you. And you were like, who are you? And I was like, never mind. We'll figure it out later. And I was like, get in the car and go. And it was just like absolutely insane. And then I got an invitation to your wedding reception that was like 2 months later. And
it was so funny because the whole car ride to City Hall, I was like, I feel really bad. Did she not feel included? She should have gotten the car with us. Why didn't she want to get in the car? She should have just come.
Not feel included. I'm like, what the fuck am I doing here? It was just
important context is that the City Hall endeavor itself was a surprise because we had a small religious ceremony with like my immediate family and like my partner's family and friends on Saturday, and my parents flew in from California. And so like we have the religious ceremony, blah, blah, blah. We're hanging out in this house that my parents have rented. And my dad goes, by the way, Nabiha, there's all this paperwork that you have to fill out because he officiated. He's like, there's all this paperwork to like blah, blah, certify. No one needs to know. I'm your dad, and God knows. And so you guys are married. And I was like, that's not how taxes work, Daddy. Like, we're not married, actually. You've just told me that all of that was a fraud. And so we sent out an email to everybody saying like, hey, surprise, like we're going to go to City Hall on Monday. You should all come. It'll be great. And so it was very impromptu. So I did feel like, oh no, okay, another person's coming. That's fine. Last thing I will say about that is we were then about to leave on a mini honeymoon, not the longer one for which I needed contact lenses. I thought the word for a mini honeymoon was baby moon. So I tell everybody that we got married very suddenly. We're going to City Hall on Monday. Then we're taking off for a baby moon for a week. Like, see you all later. And so everyone in my life thought that I had gotten knocked up, gotten a shotgun marriage. And like 3 months later, everyone's like, you're looking great. And I'm like, thank you.
I know.
That is an awesome story.
That is a really good story. We'll
We-
leave this story about how John tried to had to go get his lock picking tools and tried to break into a food truck that was fired for Nabiha's wedding reception many months later for a different time on a 95. Yeah. Well, it's never ends. Anyway.
We are going to leave it there. We will be back tomorrow with Alina Polyakova to talk about all things Russia. Nabiha, you are a great American. It is great to meet you, and come back and join us early and often again. And we are going to be back tomorrow, 22 hours and 52 minutes from now. Wow. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but we can crash weddings.
Yeah, we sure can. And we will.